Okay, I think we'll get started as people continue to join us. So, Excellencies, co chairs, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening for those joining online from all different parts of the globe. My name is Lyndall Bull, and I'm the Value Added Innovation Coordinator within the Forestry Division here at the Food and Agriculture Organisation of the United Nations, located in Rome, Italy. I'm delighted to be your moderator for this webinar today called Financing the Future, Unlocking Investments for a Thriving Forest-Based Bioeconomy. For those of you that joined us for the first webinar, you may know that this is the second webinar of a global webinar series, which is an integral part of the country and organisation-led initiative on sustainable forest-based bioeconomy, or COLI. And this is supported by the Federal Ministry, Agriculture and Forestry, Climate and Environmental Protection, Regions and Water Management of the Republic of Austria, and the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry of Finland. By way of background to the COLI, in 2024, together with partners and organisations, Austria started COLI to enhance forest-based bioeconomy approaches worldwide. In addition to Austria, Australia, Finland, Japan, Turkey, FAO, and IUFRO are currently part of COLI's steering group. COLI is a process to exchange and elaborate different approaches in the field of forest-based bioeconomy at the global level. Its work contributes to the proposed actions of the Omnibus Resolution of the 19th United Nations Forum on Forests, as well as the latest programme of work of FAO's Committee on Forestry, or COFO, as you may know it. This webinar is the second of 6 webinars in the global series, and over the course of the rest of 2025, there'll be 4 more webinars on topics related to the forest-based bioeconomy. This includes supply chain considerations, agri-food systems transformation, the role of wood in the bioeconomy, and the importance of cooperation. We'll place in the chat the dates of the remaining 4 webinars in the series. During today's webinar, I encourage all of you to put your comments and questions into either the chat or Q&A function, and we will have time for question and answers after our panel discussion. So we look forward to your thoughts, insights, questions, and perspectives with us as this webinar progresses. So without further ado, let's get started on the content. The forest-based bioeconomy represents a significant opportunity to address global challenges with substantial benefits in areas including, but not limited to, carbon sequestration, job creation, and sustainable development. As we know, forests offer a wealth of opportunities for people and the planet. However, the expectations placed on them continue to grow. And managing the risks and trade-offs associated with the delivery of the broad range of forest products and services presents us with many challenges. According to the projections published in the Global Forest Outlook 2050, published by FAO, the consumption of forest products is expected to increase significantly in coming decades, with estimates of around a 30% increase to 2050. Meeting this product demand alone, in addition to the other requirements placed on forests, will require innovation in forests and across value chains. This innovation, perhaps most importantly, includes that related to finance, which of course brings us to today's webinar. While access to finance will be one of the most important enablers for the success of a forest-based bioeconomy, the financial landscape of forest-based value chains is broad and complex. It encompasses many mechanisms and context-specific consideration, which is why today's discussion is so important, and also why I'm completely thrilled with the fantastic suite of speakers that we have with us. Our country representatives and experts have experience in forest-based finance and investment from all corners of the globe. Over the course of today's webinar, we'll learn about the importance of the forest-based bioeconomy at the country level, the diverse financial mechanisms which exist to support its development, and how we might unlock opportunities for the forest-based bioeconomy across a range of different geographies and contexts. Given the importance of the forest-based bioeconomy in the Global South and the diverse challenges that it faces, this webinar will include a number of insights for and from the Global South. To kick things off though, we will launch a quick poll to find out what regions you're joining us from. So will pop up a poll, which I'm hoping you can see on your screen now. And you should be able to select a response to show where you're calling in from. So that seems to be coming to an end. I'll end that there. Hopefully you can all now see that. So as we can see, the majority of you are from Europe, but we do have some good representation, particularly from Africa. I will note that the reflection of where you're all from, I think, is partly due to the time of the webinar. We will move the webinars around to try and enable different parts of the globe to join each of the webinars. So our next one will be much earlier in the day, and hopefully we'll get better representation then from Asia in particular. So let's carry on. So now we'll move on to our opening remarks. Each of these webinars will be co-chaired by different countries that have a strong interest in the forest-based bioeconomy. And today, I'm particularly pleased to announce that we have representatives from the countries of Laos People's Democratic Republic and Sweden joining us. Following their opening remarks, we will have a keynote speech, and then we'll move to a panel discussion with our esteemed experts before providing you, our audience, with an opportunity to submit your questions to our speakers. So it is now my very great honour to introduce our first country co-chair speaker, Dr. Somvang Phimavong, the Director General of the Department of Forestry at the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry in the Laos People's Republic. Dr. Phimavong, the floor is yours, and please open our webinar for us.
Thank you. Thank you. Sabadi, and warm greeting from Lao People Democratics. It's an honor to join you today as the co-chair of this very important global dialogue on the forest finance and investment. So let me begin by expressing my appreciation to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United States Nation and the government of Australia for their leadership in initiating this country and organization-led initiative and for convening this global webinar series. As you know, forests offer a powerful pathway for achieve multiple objectives: climate resilience, biodiversity conservation, rural livelihood, and inclusive economic development. In Laos PDR, 70% of our land is designated as a state forest land, home to more than 3,000 villages, with even more covered by non-state forests. So these forests continue to serve as a foundation for the national identities and community well-being, covering over half of our national territory. Yet, we are also face major challenges, especially deforestation, forest degradation, worsened by limited technical capacity, budget constraint, while ensuring that these forests are sustainably managed and restored. So one of the most critical enablers of this transformation is access to finance. However, in many countries like ours, mobilizing capital for sustainable forestry remain very complex issue. So public finance, while very important, cannot meet the scale of investment required. Therefore, unlocking diverse and innovative financing mechanisms, blended finance, green bonds, climate fund, and private sector investment becomes not just very important, but very urgent for Laos PDR. So in this regard, policy environment play an important role. At national level, Lao PDR is working to strengthen regulatory and institutional framework to de-risk investment and build investor confidence. So we are advancing reforms in land use governance, forest certification, emission reduction mechanism to rate price, while also enhancing transparency, accountabilities in forest value chain. These efforts aim to create a more stable, predictable, responsible investment environment. So, equally importantly is the roles of collaboration. We believe that public-private partnership must go beyond transaction relationships and evolve into long-term alliance built on trust, shared values, and mutual benefit. Whether it's large-scale timber processing, smallholder cooperatives, or ecosystem service market, we must ensure that forest investment reflects our interests and aspiration of all stakeholders, especially local communities, women, and youth. So today's webinar is an opportunity for us to explore how financial flow can better align with the sustainable forest outcome. It invites us to reflect on the time frame of forest investment, where patent capital, policy stability, and stakeholder inclusion are key ingredients for this success. It also gives us a space to share emerging approaches from different parts of the world and to deepen global cooperation in support for forest-based bioeconomies. As we prepare for the expert panels, I invite all participants to engage with a spirit of openness and creativity. So let us use this moment not only to exchange ideas, but also to inspire concrete action that can foster sustainable investment in forests and people. So thank you again for this very wonderful opportunity to be part of this important conversation. Look forward to the insightful dialogue ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phumavong. You shared with us so many valuable insights and applied experiences from your country. So, I really sincerely thank you for that. So many important and useful messages that you just shared, but I guess I particularly picked up on the importance of the enabling policy environment. And also I really liked your messages around shared values, mutual benefits, and trust. And I particularly liked your call for concrete actions at the end. So thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to have you with us. It is now my deep pleasure to introduce our next esteemed country co-chair, Miss Emily Mollen. Miss Mollen is the Deputy Director of the Ministry of Rural Affairs and Infrastructure in Sweden. And Miss Mollen, the floor is now yours. Thank you.
Well, hello and warm greetings from Sweden. Thank you to the FAO and also for colleagues in Austria and Finland for making this webinar happen. For Sweden, the bioeconomy is central to achieving our climate targets, while also fostering economic growth, job creation, competitiveness, and rural development. In Sweden, the forest-based value chain has a strong legacy of being important to our economy. It has been for more than a century, and going forward, it is central for green transition as renewable products substitutes more in greenhouse gas intensive materials. But the wood-based bioeconomy, it operates on a commercial basis, and the government believes that investment should primarily come from private capital. However, we do work a lot on the enabling conditions, and I'll mention a few. One of the cross-cutting aspects is prioritizing education, research, and innovation for scaling up. We have increased our research funding for the circular bioeconomy, and also the industries are contributing both financially and in practice. And within our research institutes, we have test and demonstration environments open to business, academia, and the public sector, as the possibility to test and evaluate an idea in an early stage reduces risk and can speed up market introduction. But I want to underline what has already been said on enabling business environment and comprehensive, predictable, and long-term stable frameworks. We know this sometimes easier said than done, but we try to work both on the sort of supply side of the bioeconomy and also on the demand side. On the supply side, we see that, well, regulatory environment and also a stable market demand. This supports investments in forest management, but also to enhance resource efficiency in processing. For promoting the mobilization, circulation, and use of residues within and between value chains, we can add more value from fewer resources and make more with every tree, so to say. And this strengthens the already robust interaction between bioeconomy and circular economy. On the demand side, it's mainly driven by climate policy to reduce emissions in other sectors. For example, in wood construction, we have updated in our building code, removing some undue barriers for tall buildings, and also introduced a requirement for life cycle assessment for new buildings. That's a material neutral policy, but as sustainable wood performs really well in a life cycle analysis, it signals all the demand that the wood construction sector and industries may invest towards. We've also seen new emission trading system incentivize bioeconomy investments. Another enabling condition is access to capital. For example, green bonds are used to finance and refinance green investments. But also, maybe interesting in this context, also an international example when our development agency, SIDA, contribute a large credit guarantee, enabling countries in the Amazon region to borrow from the Inter-America Development Bank to invest in projects in sustainable land use, forest conservation, restoration and management, and bioeconomy development. What I wanted to say with all of that is that there's a broad range of tools that we can work with, and they may need to be different along the wood value chain and also in different parts of the world. And in our discussions today, I hope to advance our collective thinking and learn more from our esteemed experts. So thank you so much, and over to you, Linda.
Thanks a lot, Emily. Really appreciate those broad as well as implied insightful contributions that you've shared with us today. And of course, you know, I mean, I think I speak for everybody that is on listening to this webinar, that, you know, Sweden offers the world so many long-term lessons and insights around the development of a forest-based bioeconomy. So we really appreciate that. And, you know, I loved your comments, particularly about education, research and innovation. You know, it's probably three of the topics most dear to my heart. So thank you. And finally, just those points you made about the range of sort of supply and demand side tools to enable the development of the forest-based bioeconomy. So I think I speak for everybody here that thank you to both our co-chairs for those welcoming remarks, because I really feel they provide us with a perfect introduction to this webinar. So thank you both to Sombang and Emily. So now moving along, and is now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Mr. Klaas Sander, the Senior Environmental Economist at the World Bank. We're lucky again because Klaas brings to us today a wealth of knowledge and expertise in sustainable finance and the forest sector. And he will be sharing his insights on financing the transition to sustainable forest-based bioeconomies. His presentation will highlight the critical financial approaches and investment opportunities that can help us transition toward a more sustainable and resilient future for our forests. Klaas, over to you.
Thank you very much, Linda. And as for the other speakers, it's an honor that I was invited to give this keynote speech. And I'm really happy to contribute a few introductory thoughts to this webinar. Next slide, please. We cannot expect that in a 15-minute presentation, we can cover everything with regard to forest finance, given that it's a very wide and very complex topic. but we hope that we can set the stage for an interesting discussion and also for an interesting exchange between our panelists and the audience today. To achieve that, we will go over a quick or a shorter presentation, touching a little bit on why forest finance matters, what are the challenging aspects of forest finance. We'll have a brief look into what the current state of play is, touch upon some of the challenges of forest finance, and then hint at a few core pathways for towards sustainable forest finance, where we're headed towards. But of course, this cannot be exhaustive or an exhaustive list. We're actually looking very much forward maybe to hearing from some of the panelists, but also from the audience, some of their insights and experiences with regard to forest finance. Next slide, please. So why does forest finance matter? Over the years and decades, we have addressed as the global forest community together, we've addressed many of the challenges of the sustainable management of global forest resources. And we have also achieved some successes, but some challenges prevail, and there are new challenges that are emerging. Deforestation and climate mitigation remain a very important topic to be addressed with regard to the management of global forest resources. There are new challenges emerging with more people demanding more from forest resources, including forest goods and services, but also the indirect benefits from forests, like tourism, like water services, like clean air purification, but also nature-based solutions with regard to climate change adaptation. There are still a lot of people living in extreme poverty that rely on forests as safety nets or to satisfy the most pressing basic needs. That is all matched by huge financing needs, and I don't want to discuss too much on the right-hand side here, but really the three categories of the financing needs that we see that fall into categories like protect and restore and enhance forest resources, establish and manage sustainably production forests to satisfy increasing human needs, especially when we look at bioeconomy, circular economy, but also climate mitigation and adaptation. And then, of course, all these indirect investments in forests when we talk about deforestation-free developments. You can see some of these numbers there. These are estimates by our colleagues from the FAO. Very difficult to estimate those numbers, and I will touch upon that throughout my presentation. Next slide, please. We also need to be aware that forest financing is happening in a very challenging environment for many of our client countries. One of those is, for example, that forest financing is happening in a very challenging governance environment, which of course poses a challenge to private sector investments in those countries. On the left-hand side, you see a graph with regard to governance index with data from 2023. Further, also credit ratings of many client countries is not as favorable as in the global south, is not as favorable as in the global north. So countries have difficulties leveraging finance on the public financial, on the global financial market to invest in public sector reforms, to invest in or to mobilize money for public sector investments in the forest, in forestry, to create enabling environments for private sector to invest. And then last but not least, an important piece of data is that in many of our client countries, tax revenues as a source to mobilize public sector investments is low and does not represent a financing source as in many other countries of the global north. So you can see these challenges altogether for many of these countries. There are limitations in mobilizing finances for public sector investments. Next slide, please. Quickly touching upon what sources of financing we're facing or we're having available. First of all, there's public domestic finance, and you could see from the previous slide that many countries have actually challenges in mobilizing that finance. What it represents is government spending at all levels funded through fiscal revenues, tax revenues often, asset income or debt delivered via budget allocations and subsidy. that public domestic finance is there to set the framework for all other investments to come in, especially private sector investments. There's the international public finance. That's the part where I'm working in from the World Bank side, and the official development assistance, ODA, and other official flows from development partners and financial institutions delivered via grants, concessional loans, equity investments, but also risk-sharing mechanisms like guarantees. Then there is probably the biggest chunk of domestic private finance, which is capital coming from commercial banks, microfinance institutions, large corporations, micro, small, medium-sized enterprises, forest producers, cooperatives, civil society, and includes both formal and informal equity and debt. And we cannot overemphasize that a large scale of this finance in many of our client countries, of the countries in the South, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is informal and often comes in small portions from private households, which are part of the private finance pillar of forest finance, to invest in maybe a few trees, in sustainable land management, in a small woodlot. But taking it all together, it makes up a huge share of domestic private finance, and we need to keep this in mind as it is an important source of financing and investments in forests and forest landscape management. And of course, then there's the international private finance from multinational corporation, institutional investors, impact investors, and increasingly also philanthropic foundations and trusts, that is delivered through a mix of equity, debt, and grants, and especially found in the area of performance-based payments, where finance is flowing based on positive impact, positive results on forest areas. We have to keep in mind that there are huge data limitations, and that only a fraction of forest finance can be reliably tracked due to fragmentation and complex, hard-to-trace flows. And partly, and I touched upon that before already, a lot of the value chains, and increasingly a lot of value chains in the global South, are informal, and the financing that feeds into these value chains, from the production of the wood, but also from throughout the value chains, the processing, the marketing, the transport, is through informal and not easily recognizable and reportable data and finance flows. Next slide, please. This is a quick snapshot of how forest finance looks like. And you can see that the big sources of finance is private domestic finance and public domestic finance. The public international ODA finance that we often talk about in settings like we have today represents only a rather small fraction of an estimated 2% here. And also the private international finance is a smaller amount than probably many of you would expect if we had run a poll on what, regarding, for example, the shares of forest finance globally. Again, it emphasizes the huge importance of the private domestic finance. And I again want to emphasize that maybe this share of the overall global forest finance flows is even larger, given the data limitations and data problems to estimate these kind of flows. On the use side, you can also see that these financing flows are going into very many different directions and very many use categories. So you can see that the sources and the users are quite fragmented and heterogeneous landscape. And then in the middle, we have the instruments, and we realize often in discussions on forest finance that in these discussions, the sources, instruments, and users are often, not very well aligned, and that I think we have to find better ways to align the sources, instrument, and users. Next slide. What are the challenges with regard to global forest finance? There are continuous persistent finance gaps for restoration, conservation, and sustainable production. There's also a limited private investment due to weak pipelines and unproven business models, but also because of the insecure investment environment which links back to the earlier slide I showed you when we look at, for example, governance frameworks in which these investments would have to be made. There's also still, and this is a problem given the nature of forestry of long production periods, a mismatch between the financing terms and the long-term forestry needs. Often the investments and the benefits and the financial flows that can be generated there are very long periods in between, which provides often a disincentive for forest investors. Many private households often just use forest as a part of their portfolio. So it's one of those, it's one of the income streams that can be utilized, but it's only one part of a very complex portfolio that we observe with rural and small investors in the rural landscape in the global south. There are also often barriers to accessing finance. I said before that a lot of the financing is happening, or a lot of investments and a lot of the value chains are happening informally. So in those environments, having access to official finance, banking institutions is often very difficult, especially for smallholders and community actors. There are also structural issues limiting results-based finance. You have to have a certain maturity, you have to have a certain institutional and policy framework to be able to meaningfully participate in results-based finance, such as, for example, carbon finance models, because you cannot, as I said, when you have a weak institutional environment, for example, not meet often very demanding MRV environments and MRV requirements. And last but not least, in many countries and many investment environments, we also see misaligned fiscal policies that do not provide sufficient incentives or support to investments, but we also see these harmful practices, harmful subsidies, which concerns more the indirect impact on forest resources when it comes, for example, to agricultural production. Next slide, please. So what could be pathways towards sustainable forest finance? First of all, one category is unlocking finance for small-scale operators. Not easy, but for example, through the use of aggregators and other supply chain models, that could be a way to improve the access for smallholders, micro, small, medium-sized enterprises and communities, and build bankability and reduce risk for financiers with business incubators for these actors, which are, as an aggregate, quite important globally for forest finance investments. Also mobilizing private investments at scale. Again, changing the investment environment, providing the security to investors is an important aspect here. Enhancing domestic public finance is important, especially for creating the overall enabling environment for private sector investors, because the private sector investors, ranging from the small, medium-sized investors to the large-scale foreign direct investors, are the most important investors in forest finance. And the deployment of ODA, again, as a catalytic enabler to supporting countries to creating these enabling frameworks, is one of the core and important issues moving forward on creating more and better sustainable forest finance flows globally. Next slide, please. Diving a little bit deeper into what small-scale operators need, again, is of course a revenue-based business model. Without revenues, no small-scale investor, no other investor probably has incentive to invest in forest resources or sustainable management of forest and forest landscape. While there are diverse financing mechanisms, they have to be made accessible through these small-scale operators. For example, as I said earlier, this could be done through the use of aggregators and intermediaries. Those could be key to really mobilize financing and realize the access to finance for the small-scale operators. And then last but not least, also unlock forest financing through blended finance and bring that up to scale. Partly also here the performance-based payments, but use really the new capital that is emerging, for example, through philanthropic institutions via guarantees, grants, or other concessional finance that can de-risk and crowd in private sector investments, especially from the smaller scale. Next slide, please. Mobilizing private investment at scale. I think I've touched already on a lot of these issues here. Key barriers persist. There is often high risk, regulatory complexity, liquidity constraints, and I think through targeted public sector investments, reducing those risks would be key. We also have to be aware that there are many different investors, and all different investors have different roles. And we cannot expect that all of these investors achieve the same goals or invest with the same objectives in mind. We have these diverse models and diverse outcomes. Corporate and institutions drive growth and jobs, but may centralize control and impact investors prioritize equity, biodiversity, and community resilience. The area of blended finance is something that is being discussed with increasing importance at the global level. But there are still a lot of stumbling blocks that need to be overcome to really unlock blended finance to reach scale that can meet then many of the global forest financing needs. Next slide. And that was all that I wanted to talk with you about today. And I hope this provided some of the aspects, that we want to discuss, and it will trigger some questions to the panel, and then also a good discussion among the audience. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Klaas. Incredibly insightful presentation that you shared with us, and your expertise and wealth of information, no pun intended there, but really appreciate just all those insights. And personally, I loved that graph that you shared. I hadn't seen that before, and giving us an insight into how those different how finance is used and the different types of finance across the value chain, data limitations notwithstanding. So I thank you for that, as well as really clear outline of the challenges and the pathways towards sustainable forest finance. So you've really given us a perfect entree, I think, into our expert panel discussion. I do remind our audience today that Klaas will rejoin us for the panel, or for the Q&A session, I should say. So if you have any questions for him that you'd like to have asked, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat or the Q&A function. So before we move on to our panel, we are going to launch one more poll for today, so a chance for our audience to interact again. So I will go down here and launch the poll. And the question that you can see on the screen there, which I can see some people are starting to answer already: what financing approach that could be used to scale up the forest-based bioeconomy would you most like to learn about? So I'll be fascinated to see your responses. I'll give you a few moments. Seem to be slowing down there, so just a little bit longer. I can see the comments come in, so you might not be able to see that at your end. Okay, I think that's come to a stop, so I will end the poll and share those results with you. So hopefully you can all see that. Obviously, you can see from that there is a deep interest in blended finance. Klaas did touch on that, and I think there are big expectations around blended finance, but obviously there are challenges there, and I think hopefully we'll hear a little bit more on that from our panel today. But obviously really high interest also in those forest-focused green bonds. So we will take this information on board and include it also in the report that we prepare on this webinar. So thanks a lot for all your contributions there. So let's move on. And I'm now really excited to welcome our esteemed panel. The diverse group of thought leaders that we've been able to bring to you today really brings vast experience across the forest sector and across a range of topics, including environmental economics, sustainable finance, and policy development. They're going to share with us their insights and practical approaches following on from Klaas's presentation about unlocking financial mechanisms that can really drive progress in sustainability and innovation in the forest-based bioeconomy. You can probably see them across your screen there, and some of you might recognise some of our speakers, but I'm happy to say that today we have with us Shauna Matkovich, who's the founding director of the Forest Link. David Brand, the chair of the International Sustainable Forestry Coalition, as well as the executive chair of New Forests. Petri Latonen, who is a forest finance expert here at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And Salima Mahamudu, who's the investment manager for blended finance for restoration, Global Restoration Initiative at the World Resources Institute. So if I could ask if our panel could all be placed on the screen from our audiovisual team, please. I assume they're coming, audiovisual. Okay, I might get going with the questions so as not to waste time, and hopefully they can get pinned on our screen shortly. So to kick things off, we have the same question for all our panel members. And so just ask you to briefly share with us your involvement in financing the forest-based bioeconomy. And I'm going to start with you, Shauna.
Yes, thank you, Lyndall, and thank you to all the other speakers and the participants for being here today. So my involvement, well, the short answer is it's the mission of my business. So I started my consulting company about 4 years ago with the intention to mobilize more private capital to profitable and impactful forest investments. So going back to Klaas's kind of categorization earlier today, I guess you could say I wear the private investment hat. And I'm particularly focused, though not exclusively, in the global south, which I think is particularly relevant to the discussion today, where I believe the forest sector is highly underfunded and where there's significant potential for growth and impact. But taking a quick step back from that, I'm a forester first and an investment professional second. So I spent the first 5 years of my career as an operational boots on the ground forester in BC, Canada, where I'm from, and later in New Zealand before taking a pivot and pursuing tropical forestry. And it's here where I became introduced to the concept of forest investment and where I've been working for the past 15 plus years. I spend a lot of my time on advocacy because, well, it's again, back to my mission. But what keeps the lights on is working with my clients. So I work largely with investors, investment managers, and the forest businesses that they invest into, again, to create profitable and impactful forest investment strategies. So what that means is that I work on ESG and impact integration and education for newer investors and investment managers coming into the space, or for forest businesses who are looking to bring in capital or need to, I guess you could say, learn the same language as investors. So I think a big challenge that we have here today, and Klaas alluded to it earlier, is that the users don't necessarily speak the same language as the investors and vice versa. So again, I work with strategy development different investment policies and procedures and on-the-ground applications, and then also work with in more of a guidance and advisory capacity, working on training and guiding teams to integrate ESG and impact into their forest investment strategies. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Shauna, and I'm really looking forward to your contributions into as part of our panel discussion with that breadth of experience that you have. I'm now going to pass over to David, if you could just give us some background on your involvement in financing the forest bioeconomy.
Okay, well, thanks, Lyndall, and pleasure to be here with you all today. So I have a couple of roles at the moment that I'm involved with. I think my primary day job is as the chair and founder of New Forests. We're an investment management business that operates across Australia, New Zealand, United States, Southeast Asia, and Africa. We manage about 4.3 million hectares. Our principal clients are institutional investors, so they're long-term investors with a highly diversified portfolio, and forestry has been attractive as just one small part, maybe 1% of these portfolios. But 1% of $100 trillion is a lot of money in institutional capital. And so the forestry sector, to make itself investable, has the opportunity, I think, really to bring more capital to bear if we can build the track record and success to attract that capital. We manage about $7 billion today. About 500 million of that is in Southeast Asia and Africa. So we have made the effort to invest in developing countries as well as the main forestry investment markets. And through that, we've developed a lot of expertise in supply chains and innovations like blended finance, landscape investing across forestry, agriculture, conservation, climate and nature finance, engagement with smallholders and farmers, a whole variety of mechanisms across different regions of the world. My second role is as the inaugural chair of the International Sustainable Forestry Coalition, which started a couple of years ago. This is a group of 17 major forest industry companies that operate about 18 million hectares across 37 countries. And we're trying to create a collective voice for the forestry sector in global policy processes that have effect on the role of forests in not only the bioeconomy transition, but also contributing to climate and nature conservation. So we have two major goals. One is to accelerate the bioeconomy transition, looking at ways that we can push faster at bringing wood fiber, other biomass-based materials into replacing more high-embodied energy or petroleum-based materials. And the second is looking at how we build a natural capital asset class. And when we bring those together, our overarching goal is to see a systems change that leads to a climate and nature positive circular bioeconomy. So thanks, Lyndall.
Thanks a lot, David, and very much looking forward to your contributions today. And we both thank and recognise you for the leadership role that you've taken in the forest-based bioeconomy, and as well as, of course, the applied experience you have both around finance, but on the ground application of forestry in such a wide range of geographies. So looking forward to hearing more from you today. And now over to you, Petri.
Well, thank you, Lyndall. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all. During my professional life over the past 4 decades, I have worked globally across both public and private sectors, primarily on investments in forestry and forest-based value chains. So I can say that actually I have been kind of dealing with investments and finance on forest bioeconomy most of my professional life. And much of this work has involved conducting due diligence or feasibility studies for forest financing decisions, whether supporting companies, financing institutions, funds or others, and to kind of assess whether these investments are viable, sustainable, impactful. And based on this experience, I have learned that forest bioeconomy depends heavily on smallholders, small and medium-sized enterprises, and other small-scale operators. And actually, this has been a recent focus of my work. It's about improving smallholders, small and medium-sized enterprises, small-scale operators' access to finance, advancing blended finance solutions that actually my two other colleagues have been mentioning, and then strengthening forest-based value chains. And I can mention that I have been recently working with FAO in the context of the Africa 100 initiative, where FAO is one partner. And I can say that I firmly believe that the small scale, that the key to the success of forest-based bioeconomy are really these small scale operators. And namely in the global south, many of these small scale operators remain informal. They have very limited stake in major value chains and restricted access to finance. So I think this is the kind of, well, it's interesting, it's a challenge, but it's a kind of gap that I'm really keen to work on closing this gap and kind of integrating small scale operators to value chains and enhance their access to finance. I think it's really kind of the way to unlock full potential of forest bioeconomy. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Petri, and I'm looking forward to some of additional applied insights from you this afternoon, particularly around small-scale operators, so thanks for that. And last but not least, we have Salima Mahamudu. Salima, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lyndall. My interest actually lays, at least my involvement has always started in the lens of the development. So around ecosystem restoration, supporting various countries from like the drier Sahel to more forested countries, savannas, like really integrating the ecosystem world of ecosystem restoration. So helping this and implement these very translated into that bridge between Shona's world around private sector and that word around philanthropic, around finding and structuring deals and investments that make sense for private sector to attract them into this world. So my most recent work has really been around structuring a financial intermediary to accelerate grants and concessional funds into ecosystem restoration, but also establishing and supporting the development of an investment platform really purely intended to mobilize private sector capital. But my interest, if I'm honest with you, is really very much more practical. And it comes from my history of work, is that we cannot scale ecosystem restoration, but even forest-based value chains if the financial models don't work. So this topic really speaks value to it. And not to mention what has already been mentioned, but right now they often don't work. So it doesn't work for smallholder farmers, like the previous speaker was saying, nor for the communities, but also from the private sector entity. There's quite a lot of mismatch and disconnection. So my focus has really always been, and my expertise is around bridging that gap and really understanding where catalytic funding can be used to support ecosystem building. Thank you so much, Linda.
Thanks a lot, Salima, and I'm thrilled that your passion is the topic of our webinar today. So, I mean, you work in such an important and interesting area, and sort of building those bridges, which let's hope that we can at least provide some insights, if not go a little further with our webinar today on some of those topics that you raised. So let's move on now to our sort of round of applied questions for each of our experts here. So Shona, starting back with you, forestry is a long-term investment with returns often taking years to materialise. Can you share with us how you think we can best address those long gestation periods in financing models and what's needed to attract more patient capital? Sort of alludes to some of those comments that David made earlier.
Yes, thank you. And I hope to not circle around the topic too much here, but I think we need a bit of a backstory, because as David mentioned, you know, it's private institutional investors might allocate about 1% of their capital to forest investments. And we often hear there's trillions available. What's wrong? Why isn't it all flowing into forests? But I think we need to take a step back and ask, why are investors drawn to forests in the first place? And so I'm focusing on forest assets themselves, so not downstream processing and other parts of the value chain. So forests offer diversification. They're largely uncorrelated with traditional markets. They act as an inflation hedge, and they're uniquely flexible. So harvest can be delayed when wood prices drop or accelerated when wood prices are strong. Plus, even when you're not harvesting, your trees are still growing, adding biological value year after year. So these are kind of the fundamental financial reasons why an institutional investor is going to be attracted to forest investment. So saying that, forests are not a high return asset class. They're long-term, which is what we're going to get into today. They're relatively low risk and with stable but modest returns. So increasingly, also, what drives capital to forests is their impact potential. So contributions to climate stability, biodiversity, and a more circular, sustainable bioeconomy. Now, where the challenge really lies, and especially in the global south, is that, I mean, to again put a bit of context, in mature markets, forest investments can generate regular cash flows from existing assets. So that's where your trees are already mature and you can be harvesting trees and making wood products right from day one. But in many parts of the global south, commercial forests are young or non-existent. Wood markets are also underdeveloped. There's no standardized pricing. There's little reward for certified sustainability, and sustainably managed forests are often in competition with informal or even illegal timber markets. To add to some of those risks, land tenure can be unclear and local forestry experience is sometimes limited. So while the risk side of the equation is high, the return side rarely compensates. And this makes it difficult to attract traditional investors that might be entering emerging markets that are looking for high risk, high return opportunities. So how do we overcome this? Again, first, we have to recognize that not all investors are the same. So the most naturally aligned players for Global South forest investments are those that are already committed to long-term impact-driven outcomes: development finance institutions, impact funds, family offices, and other mission-aligned investors. So these investors value forests for more than just their financial return. But to bring in a broader investment race, we have to directly address the key barriers, and we've had some from Klaus already, and I'm sure we'll hear of some more. But the long time horizons, which is the question that I'm asked to speak to today, illiquidity, which ties into that long time horizon, and then of course risk, which is kind of wrapped in throughout everything. So I have three strategies that I would suggest to building financial models and asset portfolios to manage these challenges. The first is asset maturity. So as I mentioned, the mature assets are not necessarily at the ready in the Global South. So where possible, portfolios could be structured to include both mature forests offering earlier cash flows and greenfield projects. So these are new or young forest establishments that provide the long-term value and also a greater impact opportunity. And the second would be blended finance, which we've all heard about today. And so again, this is a powerful and underutilized tool. I know that it's something that people are wanting to learn more about it today. Just to do a little plug to a podcast that I run, I've recently actually just did 2 separate episodes on blended finance, speaking to a multilateral development expert on blended finance and also someone from Convergence. So I would point you to those for more information. But essentially, as we've discussed, this is combining public and philanthropic or less commercial capital together to shift risk away and make it more attractive for private investors. And then carbon finance. So well-designed reforestation or afforestation projects can start generating carbon credits within, let's say, 5 years, long before timber revenues appear. So if done with integrity and aligned to market standards, carbon credits can significantly improve early stage cash flows and enhance overall impact. So in short, while forestry is and always will be a long-term game, there are financial structures that can address the gestation period and bring in more patient capital. But it does take this creativity that we're talking about in structuring, for example, blended finance that suits both sides of the equation, and a shared understanding that forests are more than just assets. That's it. Thanks.
Well, that might be it, Shauna, but that was a fantastic introduction, I think, to our panel discussion. It was such a great introduction of the landscape. So I really thank you for those insights. And maybe you could put in the chat, feel free to the link to your podcast. I'm sure many people would want to listen. Okay, next to you, David. So attracting private and impact investors means having a clear revenue model, whether through forest product sales or ecosystem services. And this can be more challenging in some global South country contexts, as we've already heard from Shauna and others. Could you maybe give us your insights and considerations about how we can go about developing and demonstrating a credible earning logic for forest investments in the global South, as through New Forests you are already doing? Thanks, David.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. That was a great platform for all of us, really, in terms of an introduction. So saves me having to restate some of that. But I will start a little bit first, Lyndall, in the developed countries, you know, the US, Australia, New Zealand, where we have considerable assets. And what's happening to me is looking at forestry as part of what we call real assets. You know, real estate, infrastructure, forestry, agriculture. These are long-term, stable assets that are expected to play a particular role in an investment portfolio. And, you know, the infrastructure investors have kind of taught us something. If you look at how they have thought about value creation, you take airport investors who bought an airport for the net present value of the landing fees. Then they realized, oh, they can add a shopping mall and a convention center and parking lots and hotels and airport lounges. And all of a sudden they quadrupled the value of those assets. And when we start to think about land and land use, in some ways there's a similar analogy where you think about the ownership of land, and then that land can be used to grow trees for forestry. It can be used to produce agricultural crops or grazing for animals or some blend of those. It can be used for conservation. But now we're seeing kind of multiple sources of revenue that can be harnessed by the investors. So whether that's climate finance or nature conservation finance, conservation easements, wind farms, solar farms, water rights, it becomes a bundle of economic opportunities that really haven't been optimized in terms of land use. And so almost everybody that's in the forestry investment business today is working through this concept of realization of option value. And when I look at emerging markets, of course, we have more difficulty. Transaction costs are very high. It can take 3 or 4 years to get a project through, you know, the process of free prior informed consent, government negotiations, counterparty negotiations, and so on. But it is, I think, emerging as a similar opportunity. And, you know, we have a fund now in Southeast Asia that's a blended finance structure. We have a Class A, which is, you know, commercially motivated investors looking for a risk-adjusted return. And then we have a Class B, which are investors that are prepared to take a lower return if the fund takes on a higher aspiration for climate solutions and nature conservation and so on. And it becomes a kind of a synergistic model where, you know, the two classes of investors are each getting more of what they want. And then alongside that, we had a long-term 12, 15-year offtake for 12 million tons of carbon removals, which then gave a fixed income into the whole investment vehicle. So you can see how these sources of option value can be packaged together to help reduce risk, reduce volatility, and create certainty. And once you can create more certainty, then the risk premia can be brought down in a sense, and that's in a sense the holy grail. And then in Africa, the way we've structured is as what we call an investment platform, where you can have a core investment strategy that's looking at plantation forestry. Alongside that, you can have some corporate investors who are looking for carbon credits. You can have some concessional funding to do agroforestry, and you can manage that all with a single entity that has the financial and management capability. So I think we are seeing innovations that will help attract more capital into the sector.
Thanks a lot, David. I mean, I couldn't thank you more for sharing with us what's an incredibly complex topic into both your airport analogy, but also moving on to your applied examples, both in Southeast Asia and Africa, into a way that we can understand, because I think sometimes it doesn't, it can be hard to get your head around sort of all those options. So thanks very much. I really appreciate it. We're now going to move to Petri and pick up on his opening comments around small-scale operators. So, Petri, the question for you is, access to finance remains a major hurdle for small-scale operators, as you touched on earlier. From your perspective and experience, what practical ways have you found to overcome this barrier?
Thanks, Linda. Well, I think the first is we have to think about the organizational level of these small-scale operators, whether they are smallholders, producers, or even small companies. And there are good experiences of aggregation of smallholders through associations, tree growers associations, or cooperatives. Or maybe these associations have evolved to cooperatives. And this is actually quite essential for achieving scale and reducing the transaction costs, at the same time then improving negotiation power with buyers and financiers. And it's actually a kind of fundament to many other things. And I think once we can say that second point is that once the, let's say, smallholders are organized, they can develop their own internal credit and savings schemes. I mean, there are lots of examples of this kind of cooperative credit and savings schemes. I don't think these credit and savings schemes, they probably do not allow investments. They are maybe more for working capital, short-term things. But I think the value of these is that these schemes enhance financial literacy. And they are actually building trust gradually with formal lenders, and they serve as a kind of stepping stone toward accessing external finance, something that actually these units have to develop something which is more bankable. So I think it's a kind of natural way towards developing them. And third could be also the first point is actually the markets, value chains, and how we can integrate smallholders really into markets and value chains. Also here we have lots of rewarding examples, and I think one that I want to mention is these partnerships with larger companies or other market participants. I'm sure that New Forest has experience of this, and they can be through, for example, outgrower schemes, offtake agreements, and well, we think conventional forest products or agricultural products, but it could also be a pathway for the small-scale small scale operators to have their share of carbon finance when you can kind of scale them up. And then maybe kind of other side of this as a fourth point is it's about these appropriate financial mechanisms. We are mentioning this blended finance, which actually is very broad, but I think the kind of blended finance or maybe other kind of risk mitigation schemes. But I think that here is the core here is that the grants are used in a very delicate and strategic way to kind of mitigate the risk and catalyze. It's actually something that hasn't been done conventionally, and we are still learning how to do it. I think it's a kind of important thing. Of course, there are then all kind of opportunities with digital financing tools, fintech platforms, which are really good for these kind of smallholders. And the last point is that, of course, it's not easy. I mean, we have lots of challenges, and what actually the governments, local governments or development partners can do. And well, we have mentioned already kind of enabling environment, but it's a lot about simple logistics, infrastructure, something that actually is serving the market access for these smallholders, and also kind of enabling this organizational development. And as a bottom line, I want to say this last is the land tenure. It's actually something, it's a fundamental thing that we can ensure the land tenure. And it could be the first thing that I said, so it's good to end here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Petri. Yeah, I mean, the land tenure is obviously critical, as you know, as well as I think well recognized challenge. But you know, the message that really came through to me from what you were talking about is this need for innovation, and not necessarily cutting edge, brand new. Might be, but it might also be you know, just new ways of doing things in the particular context that you're talking about. So yeah, thank you for all those insights. And I think it's a good segue into what Salima might share with us. So Salima, your question really builds on some of those comments from Petri. So scaling forest-based value chains and restoration efforts requires engaging small-scale operators effectively. What are some pathways or models you see for building scale from the ground up?
Thank you, Lyndall. That's such a critical question, particularly for those working in the global south, because scale for us often doesn't mean bigger operators. It simply means replicable successes at the grassroots level. So engaging more and more of those smallholder farmers or small operators to really be able to like maintain scale and create an impact at a scale. There's maybe 3 pathways that I want to share, and I would like it's 3 pathways that I think works, but not in all contexts. And I'll try to like highlight those nuances. The first one is aggregation platforms. And many of you, I think Klaas mentioned it, but even Petri mentioned it. It is a faster way of aggregating, like through a local NGO or like a cooperative, to aggregate 30 smallholder or enterprises to be able to do ecosystem restoration, or just like have like a same bioeconomy goal. So that works. But if you look at the history of finance, not just in the sector of forest, aggregation platform has a negative stigma. And I think in this particular sector, it is important to understand what are we using the aggregator for. For instance, for ecosystem restoration with the Terra Fund, for instance, for AFI 100, we've used aggregator platforms to help us ensure compliance, reporting, access to finance, through trickle down to those 30 plus enterprises that they were, or smallholder farmers that they were working with. So that is mean that we are using them, but we're also like really dedicating a portion of the effort to them, really not removing the entire work that is to be done. So I think aggregation platforms are important, but we do need to be careful about where we bring them on. The second pathway I'll say that has been really helpful, and we keep saying it, is blended finance. But I would say blended finance with the right type of tools, in particular too. And I'll mention why I say that. Because to me, if you look particularly in the southern part of the world, in the global south, we do need more financing, but it needs to come at a concessional rates because we are simply not able to match market rates, especially with smallholder farmers and small operators in general. They're just way too fragile to be able to operate at a market rate. So concessional loans and grants, entry points type of financing to really scale them up, but it needs to be paired with technical support and pipeline development. If you really want the whole ecosystem to be blended, so different layers of financing being overlayered, but with the right type of de-risking mechanism. So it can be guarantees with CEDA. We've worked with CEDA around like guarantee mechanism. It can be first loss capital with some DFIs that are willing to enter in those. It can be simple technical capacity building. It can be pipeline development. We've worked with a lot of banks that are simply saying we want to invest, but we just simply do not understand the sector enough to be able to invest in those small operators and so on. So all that to say, blended finance is important, but the money alone isn't sufficient. It needs to build along with other de-risking mechanisms to be able to really make sure that we get to the impact we're aiming to. And the last one, and Petri really alluded to that, is value chain integration, but also co-investments. We're not seeing a lot of co-investment, especially with smaller operators. We see them at the larger, more mature operators where co-investment naturally comes into hand. But with the small scale operators, we don't really often see them, but yet they're the one who actually lack access to markets and processing facilities and many others. So co-investment, co-design projects at that downstream buyer level is so key, because then it allows you to kind of imagine the pathway that will be both accessible to them, but also ideal for whoever is the buyer on the other side. So this can be in all sorts of sectors, shea, timber, carbon buyers, or anything. It really builds that scalability model. But all of this needs to tie in a genuine logical local legitimacy. What I've seen to be made in particularly in areas where local operators were supported with additional financing and really having an interest in them, the local legitimacy kind of leaves the room and creates place for more. So all that to say that we do need long-term partnership when we're engaging with those small scale operator, particularly at the local level, to really ensure that the capital that is being met is meeting local community needs and really ensuring that there is a genuine integrity pathway into these processes. So those were the three kind of concrete examples that I really wanted to share into what I've seen to be working in integrating and building scale from the ground up. Back to you, Lyndall.
Thank you, Salima. And look, what a fantastic round out to that group of panel questions. I loved your term logical legitimacy. I might use that. I think it's a great term. And, you know, you touched on but built on many things that some of our other speakers have said. You know, you touched on some of the importance around partnerships that, you know, I think Sombang opened us with. And, you know, this sort of idea that money alone is not sufficient. But you also touched on, you know, there's certainly some energy and interest around blend, or expectations maybe, around blended finance. You know, that came out in our poll, and I think in one way or another, in a way, it's been touched on almost by all of you. So we have got a little bit of time for Q&A this afternoon. And so feel free to send us your questions. I'm sorry, having said that, I won't get to all of them, of course. But this is the time to ask our esteemed panelists and experts some queries that you might have. So I am going to, I'm just looking at the Q&A list here that we have. Klaas, I'm going to start with a question for you, and building on those comments around blended finance that we've heard today. And the question is that you mentioned, but I think others did as well, the existence of stumbling blocks to upscale blended finance. Can you elaborate and provide some examples for the audience, and then I'll give an opportunity for any of our other panelists to provide comments. Klaas.
Sure, thank you, Lyndall. I think, let me start with some, but maybe also the other panelists have additional ideas and can complement my thoughts there. But I think sometimes to bring in public and private sector finance, especially in the global south, it's just like sometimes, public investors, private investors coming in at a different time. There's not a good sequence. There's not a good coordination. Sometimes there are conflicting interests. Maybe that private sector finance that comes in has a very particular interest. I see a lot of interest now in, for example, in performance-based payments and carbon finance and other finances. And then the public sector finance is not ready yet for that. I alluded to that earlier, that, often these performance-based mechanisms require quite a strong framework, like on MRV, on other things. And that, in that moment, maybe the public sector finance is not ready to invest in that or establish that kind of framework. So sometimes just, being there at the same time in the same geographic location with the same objectives sometimes just doesn't match up. And in many of these situations, it's just like then opportunities kind of like go by and then do not emerge again. As you can see also from the map that I showed on the governance context, sometimes there are opportune moments, but then they disappear again. So it's sometimes also just the continuity and the consistency of investment or favorable investments environments that are often not there for the amount of time that would be needed for really realizing force positive investments. I think those are some, but maybe some of the panelists have other ideas. Since I'm speaking, I would like to make one other comment. Is that we often allude to this challenge of the forest investment and the benefits that come in forestry, that there's a lot of time gap. But you also should see that I think once a certain critical mass of investment has been done, then you can actually realize permanent flows of benefits coming from a forest investment. And I think that is what we've seen actually with quite a lot of smallholders, like what I said earlier, when they integrate forestry into their whole portfolio of rural investments, maybe, perennial agriculture, but then also fruit, vegetables, and trees. Then with that kind of portfolio, you realize quite a stable return on these investments. And I think forestry is part of that and can be permanently then also reinvested in forest positive investments. And I think that is important, that through these portfolio of investments, we realize permanent income streams from forestry, and that we do not always have to have this time gap between the investment and the benefit. Thank you.
Thanks, Klaas. And just given I am conscious of timing, wanting to ask as many questions as possible, but I am also conscious of the interest in blended finance. I'm just wondering if any of our other panelists want to make any other comments on it. Just unmute, Shauna.
Yeah, I'm sorry, jumped in there.
No worries.
So I completely agree with everything Klaas mentioned. And I was just jotting down some quick words that came to mind. Patience being one, because again, going back to the relation or different objectives, from the commercial and the, let's say, concessional pieces. And often the concessional piece wants to take more time and the commercial piece wants to move more quickly. And so you have to kind of come to terms on that. And it is a long discussion, and it requires commitment together with that patience. So if you want to make a deal quick, then this isn't the strategy for you to go for a blended finance structure. Open-mindedness to some extent as well, because again, you're discussing very different terms with regards to the impact and the commercial objectives in some cases, and then trust. So really important to build and take the time to build these trusting relationships between partners.
Thanks, Shauna. And I think you've really circled back to some of those opening comments that we heard from Sombang. So that was great. Anyone else? Petri, you're unmuted. Or not deliberately?
Yeah, I should. Well, what to add here? I mean, I guess it's when we talk about blended finance, we also it's a very broad topic. I know that the fund managers like to talk about blended finance vehicles, where they have really kind of tailored but it can be actually blended finance also at the project level, like let's say matching grants. I mean, kind of simple mechanisms where you kind of use grants, matching grants, so that you can get the loan, for instance. So in a way that I think that important is that we also keep, when we talk about this term, let's have a very broad interpretation of this blended finance. So that's probably what I want to say.
Thanks a lot, Petri. Okay, we might pick up another question to try and get through a few here. Time is closing in on us. It's very hard to choose one, I have to say. But there's one here about the cost of capital. I might ask this of you, David. The question says, when country risk premium adds 6 to 10% rate to the cost of borrowing, what can be done? Investments in agricultural flowing. What about addressing this issue of harmful subsidies and incentives? Is there anything that can be done? Do you have any comments to that question?
That's a big question. Okay, the basic cost of capital in forestry, as the questioner alludes to, is that we're trying to look at a risk premium that's appropriate to the cash flows that we're effectively investing in. And the way that's been done in the past is you have the US 10-year Treasury bill, which we've heard a lot about lately, thanks to all the tariffs and everything. But we add a risk premium for the forestry sector to that 10-year Treasury bill, because that's what you can get if you take little or no risk. And in the US, that might be 500 basis points for forestry. Australia and New Zealand, maybe 700 basis points. But as you move into emerging markets, there's different country risk premia that are added on, that maybe another 500 or 600 basis points. And so that means that you have to have cash flows that can be discounted at that rate, and that's the value of the asset. And in many cases, the problem is that when you are trying to discount those cash flows at that kind of a discount rate, the asset doesn't have any net present value, and therefore you can, it doesn't meet the hurdle rate that you can invest in. So you do have ways that you can manage that. I said some of this at the beginning. Carbon finance has been important because you can start to get, say, a 10-15 year offtake that creates a fixed income that can help to lever up some of the returns. If you can get some of the risk profile removed, so for example, things like the first loss facility, people that are funding the due diligence costs, because in emerging markets, one of the biggest problems is you may spend $2 million getting through all the hoops of making an investment. And then if you find something at the end and have to pull back, that's all lost money. So people are very loath to do that. And now there are people, or some of the DFIs and so on, are starting to put up facilities that will pay for your due diligence costs. And if you close the deal, you pay them back. If you don't, they take it. And that really helps, facilitate investment, because that getting over that initial transaction cost hurdle is quite important. So we are, I think, finding ways over time that we can manage some of these issues, and we've successfully deployed, as I say, several $100 million into these type of forestry projects, and we've had our share of problems, but we've also had some successes.
Thank you,
Can I
David.
maybe just add?
Yeah, go for it, Salima.
If time allows, completely agreeing with David. And I would say on the last point around where some DFIs are willing to step in, we're seeing a little bit more in other countries, but not so much in Africa. But now a lot of DFIs are actually interested in opening the dialogues with some of more of those technical centers and partners to really build that understanding. So I think completely, just to reiterate that this is such a need, and just strategically using the philanthropic money that we have to attract and catalyze additional funding. I think most of the philanthropic funding out there and donors are just tired of giving. They would want to see just more like money being like capitalized. Like if they're giving I don't know, $1, then it's like max to like 5x or more. So this is an entry point for us to like really being able to build that narrative that there is an entry point with various type of donors, and their money can strategically be used to cover first loss, to secure guarantee, or to even be coming in for pipeline development and really reduce that due diligence processes that often take quite a lot of money and might not necessarily land on a deal. So just to reiterate, David, that absolutely, but I would love to see it, for instance, just in Africa, I would love to see a lot more of those interests to take more risk and redefining what risk means in the context of forestry and restoration in the context of Africa.
Thank you, Salima. Excellent. Right, now a little challenge for our panelists, because I'm going to ask you to be super succinct and give us some final messages. So I'm going to ask one final question of all of you, the same question, to leave our audience with some, final message. So, forest investments in the global south, as we've heard today, face a wide range of risks, be it political, regulatory, market, environmental, etc. Can you give us one take-home message about some strategies, pathways that you think we should be maybe doing some more work on to help mitigate and share those risks? And I might go backwards this time and start with you, Salima.
I would say we need to develop clear and measurable revenue logic. There's not enough transparency into what is happening on the MRV, like the monitoring and reporting, because a lot of these sectors are informal. And I think it was new projections, local track records, really to help the investors, but also on the other side, the community or the country to move doubt-free. So the goal isn't necessarily to eliminate risk, but maybe to share it more wisely across the different parties involved.
Thank you for that, Salima, that sharing idea again. And to you, Petri.
Yeah, I think that there is maybe two parts. I mean, the first part would be maybe kind of addressing the root causes. And that's actually kind of something that all development partners are struggling with. So it means that it's about policy dialogue and advocacy. I mean, to kind of think about the regulatory frameworks and fiscal policies. I mean, that's something that we have to address these root causes, because that's of course. I mean, maybe it's a kind of long-term process, but that has to be done. But at the same time, I kind of think that the same lines with Salima, that actually there are many ways of kind of reducing these risks, and I'm kind of repeating myself. I really want to emphasize this, that these grants should be used in a very clever catalytic way. I think that's not somehow happening. I mean, something that it's really to think how to use these, so they are primarily mitigating these risks. And then I think that when we talk about risks, I think that we have to talk about sharing the risks, how we could better share the risks. And there I think that we have many ways to do. So I think over for the next, please.
Thanks a lot, Petri. I loved your point about clever and catalytic. It's fantastic. To you, David.
Well, I think, Lyndall, as I said at the outset, we're trying to bring the whole forestry sector together and think about reconceptualizing the role of forestry in society. And it's not about taking, say, the U.S. timberland investment model and trying to put that in Africa or Southeast Asia. It's about rethinking what we're now calling a natural capital asset class that is trying to make large-scale contributions to climate mitigation and adaptation, to social justice, to freshwater regulation, to nature conservation as part of the investment model. And when you look at the global investors, these are so-called universal investors, they're taking a slice of the whole economy. These things are systemic risks, and we need to be able to bring solutions. Right now, there's just a lot of noise, and you don't even know if you're winning or losing. And so I think that's one of the things as a forestry sector, that we can try to create this new model that will allow us to find a different way to attract capital into the forestry sector.
Thanks, David, and great message. And I'm so pleased with this panel because I think we're all making contributions along the lines of what you're talking about there. So I've heard those insights today. So thank you, Shauna.
Yeah, speaking to sharing risk, I think we've touched on a lot of them, and the one I keep coming back to is partnerships and relationships. And I think also, I would encourage all the participants, the people on the panel, think about the corner of the sector that you find yourself in. Think about the objectives that you have and how you can help to reduce that risk, because so often we put it on the other parties at the table. It's their responsibility to do X, it's their responsibility to do Y. I'm here to do A, B, C. And it's teamwork. We all need to take responsibility for what we can and really work on working together and filling the role that we can.
Thank you, Shauna. And last but not least, but circling back to our first keynote speaker, Klaas, did you want to make any final comments?
Just very quickly, I really want to emphasize also what Petri said, that, if there's grant money available, and here we come also to the small fraction of this ODA that we saw in this earlier graph, how do we use this money that's coming in? Yes, we can use it for all kinds of like institution building, capacity building, and many useful things. But I think also using some of this for like these catalytic grants, I think that would be one way to also move forward. And then indirectly also responding to one of the questions that I saw in the Q&A pop-up window was like, I think strengthening the confidence in these in the value chains and in the demands that we're seeing increasing, especially in the global south, that what I said earlier is currently largely informal, but that from a government perspective, we communicate that this is something wanted, that just, what the government wants is to put them on a sustainable track. I think that would really create confidence in investors, again, from the small scale end to the other end of the large scale investors, to really invest in those and not just run them from day to day, but really have a more medium to long term perspective in these value chains, build them up. I think it would be the benefit to all to have better products, to have more efficient processing, but also to invest more in the sustainable management of the forest resources that feed into those value chains. I think building that trust and communicating that trust, I think, would be really, really important. Thank you.
Thanks, Klaas. Some great final messages there, both about sustainable forest management, but also trust. And with that, excellencies, co-chairs, ladies and gentlemen, panelists, it's sadly time to draw the webinar to a close. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. So I really hope that our audience feels the same. I can see many more questions in the Q&A. So if that's one indication, you've also found it insightful. I won't speak for long to close the webinar. I know it is the end of the day for many of us, particularly those of you in the Asia Pacific region. So, we've heard many things today, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but particularly, recognition that financing is an essential catalyst for the development of the forest-based bioeconomy. And our speakers really enforced the need for innovation around finance if we're going to meet that broad range of expectations that are placed on the forests and increasingly placed on the forests. And I guess I just want to highlight, whilst there's some needs and many challenges, particularly in the global south, I really appreciate that our speakers shared with us the range of opportunities and sort of tangible ways that we can really move forward on this topic. And I do just want to finally highlight, because there were words that just sort of came up over and over, and I think it's worth just reiterating them one more time. The importance of scale, inclusivity, but these words, trust, partnerships, shared value, I heard those again and again today. So, we will continue to work on those as a forest community. And I guess finally, actually, Petri touched on this point, this sort of need for ongoing dialogue. You know, this is a complex area, finance generally, but also, you know, the development of the forest-based bioeconomy. You know, we are from, you know, the development of this webinar series here at FAO, we are, you know, really trying to make some inroads on that. And so we'll continue to build on these discussions over the course of 2025, as I mentioned in my opening. But we also have the opportunity for you to answer a very short survey. So we'd really, one of my colleagues will put it in the chat, and we'd really appreciate if you could respond to that. We will share with all registered participants that survey, as well as the resources for today, the PowerPoints, and a link to the webinar report and recording. Just speaking on the full webinar series, sorry, you know, just a reminder that our next webinar will be on the 24th of June. And that is entitled From Forest to Market, Building Resilient and Sustainable Bioeconomy Supply Chains. And information for the specific link for that webinar will be shared in due course. So finally, I want to thank everybody for joining today. Of course, a special thank you to our esteemed country representatives and panelists for taking the time to prepare and participate today at all sorts of hours. So, you know, our deep and sincere thanks. Also our thanks for, you know, being so generous with your expertise and perspectives and insights that you've all built up over a number of years. So thank you for sharing that with us today. I also want to express my thanks again to our partners, Austria and Finland, for their ongoing support and commitment to the forest-based bioeconomy generally, but also this webinar series specifically. And a heartfelt thank you to my colleagues who have, we've worked together to make today possible. So in particular, thanks to Erica, Francesca, and Natalia. And finally, to you, our audience, without you, there would be no webinar. So thank you for joining us today and continuing to join us over the course of the series. So with that, I will close the webinar and wish you a pleasant evening or rest of day, depending on where you are in the globe, and hope to see most of you on the 24th of June. So thanks very much.